Hey, today I want to talk about tech debt, but not just tech debt, not just the technical factors around tech debt. I want to talk about the human factors that contribute to tech debt because I find that that has a far greater impact than the tech debt itself. And I also want to talk about some ideas of what we might do about it as well. So, who am I? I'm Ruth. I'm a fractional product and design leader. I have been super lucky to work with some very large names and some very, very fun startups in the Canadian space. I've also been lucky to work on about a dozen award-winning projects for design. And over the years, I have deliberately worked with an unorthodox mix of clients and domains. Some were high growth, some were barely growing, some were radically innovative, some were almost completely allergic to change. But despite their differences, what was most fascinating to me was that they all shared some of the same traits that eventually broke their products and by extension, their code bases as well. And that thing is an inattention to the slow-moving forces that incrementally chip away at your business and your technology. We'll get into that in just a second. I have a question, which is a bit of a strange question, but have you ever been on fire? Because I have. I'm really curious about where the other adrenaline junkies are. Because I feel like you have to be one to do this kind of thing. And I know some of you are out there because it's fun. But anyway, most people run from it, which is natural and reasonable. Because I think all of us, as a kid, you learn, you touch fire, you get burned, you learn fire hurts. But I think if you don't push through that, you kind of miss what it's trying to teach you. And I love Henry Rollins, but he had this phenomenal essay called Iron and the Soul. And it's technically about weightlifting, but it's really about pain. And in it, he wrote, "Pain is not my enemy. It is my call to greatness." And that's absolutely true. Like nothing ever worth doing was easy. It just isn't, an easy thing. It has not led to the greatest depth of learning for me. And I know it probably hasn't for most of you either. Yet we spend the majority of our careers and really the majority of our lives dodging pain, even though it's like absolutely guaranteed to find us. Work itself is painful. It leads to stress. Stress leads to a lot of hasty decision making. And a lot of that hasty decision making leads to hasty implementations. And all of that lives rent free in your code base. Like companies can fail dramatically as well. And that drags everyone else down in flames. And even if you survive, being successful often means navigating like a brittle legacy code base, a UX that absolutely makes you and your customers cringe. Sales will be gasping for air, while on the engineering side, we mutter, "Hey, we told you it wouldn't scale." But sales also isn't wrong because you needed the revenue to survive. There wouldn't have been a code base to have technical debt without sales and revenue. And when all of that goes wrong, you end up with low revenue, which leads to layoffs, which leads to really intense politics and devolves into absolute chaos. And all of that chaos leads to even more hasty decisions and even more hasty implementations because that's what it takes for those decisions to happen in time. And when they all over-encumber your product, it over-encumbers your maintainability. And all of that has a human cost. As a job seeker, you're told to look out for the red flags, to find the right place, to avoid those smells. But here's the thing, it happens everywhere eventually. It is just a matter of time. As job seekers, you often ignore the warning signs, pretend it's not happening, pretend it's not happening again. But until it's really time to do that lemon dance all over again, it hits that stage, then you're like, ooh, what's the next place that's not quite in this situation yet? Or you just check out sometimes and hold on as long as you can. But there's a cost to that, If you're not really intentional on what it is that you're doing, what is the cost of that? That also leads to hastiness or implementations that may not, be quite right. There's a real cost to just that checkout. So I went on a bit of a strange mission. I joined some of the best companies and the most innovative companies that would have me. And intentionally I joined some of the slowest growing and some of them that had the most opportunity. And it was to really find out what actually breaks inside of companies. Why, in spite of this being famously talked about, do smart people keep missing it? And what does it mean for the product and, by extension, the code and its maintainability? I diagnose it as drift. And this is where I find that there's a number of slow-moving factors that happen so slowly, it's actually hard to notice over time until it's difficult to fix. It's kind of like watching a kid grow up. Like, one second they're a small baby, you then look over and they're like, oh my gosh, they're a fully grown adult. And so in order to illustrate this, I want to kind of take a trip back in memory lane to an earlier, simpler time of the internet, actually, to McDonald's.com. This is McDonald's.com 30 years ago. And if you went on the internet at that time, every website looked completely different. It was kind of the Wild West, and you see that play out over the years. So that was in 1996, I believe. This is in Y2K. Again, Wild West, very corporate. Again, another corporate sort of design, but again, very visually different. It's not until about 2010 you start to see Apple's influence from their launch of the iPhone a few years prior and their use of skeuomorphism, which is a concept in design where you have things that look like objects in real life. And so those objects in real life sometimes can start to look a little bit dated, but you saw like on these menu bars, these 3D rounded bevels and buttons. They look like they're being physically pressed in. It was a really interesting design choice by Apple, and you start to see it in the broader internet. You see it again in 2015, 2 years after Apple switched to flat design. So you see Apple's influence once again reach the broader internet. And sorry to just geek out design nerds. I promise I'll pull myself back in a little bit. Apple made a move to flat design because it's really influenced by modernism and Bauhaus styles. And skeuomorphism, as you saw, can start to look a little bit dated. It's about as dated as the objects that you base them off of. And with modernism and Bauhaus, it's super timeless. If you go and look at a Bauhaus architecture in Germany from like the 1930s, it will look just as modern as any building going up today. 2 years after Apple introduced it, we start to see this reach the broader internet, as I mentioned. And it just remains timeless and classic. This website could exist today, although it's a little hard to update with those images and with the text. You're always thinking about the readability in the image. And so what they did was in 2019, they upgraded to an easier to maintain card-based system that just gives them a little bit more flexibility around the content, but really like the design language is pretty similar. So a bit of a shift. One was more of like a visual design shift. The next was more of a technological, easy maintainability shift. It's been about 6 years since we've seen their last change on their website. So this one might be around for a little bit longer. And so anyway, this design exploration is kind of weird, and that's why I wanted to go through it with you. Because this website has lived for nearly 30 years. And on one side, you might imagine that there would have been more than 5 iterations over 30 years to their website. So on one hand, design is incredibly slow to evolve. But on the other, if you did go back to any of those earlier websites, they just are so dated that they almost look untrustworthy today. Like going back to the Y2K version of the website, would you even click on it? It looks like it's going to give you malware or something. It's just changed that dramatically, and it actually impacts our perception of trustworthiness. And so this evolution has happened more than just in design. It's also happened on the infrastructure side, for example. So we used to have managed servers, managed infrastructure, and using tools like Puppet for synchronization across those things. And now we've moved to platform as a service. And then within that, there were modernizations like Docker, Kubernetes, Helm. We actually found that with software development itself, it went from monolithic architectures to microservices. And I think that actually was in part due to a major shift in project management style, where we had waterfall and then moved to agile. And so it just became harder to work on monolithic systems because you didn't have the full view up front anymore. So I think those two things really kind of impacted each other. And just as a side note, it seems like JavaScript just changes every 5 minutes. Let's be real. But anyway, what makes this even more tricky is that the business itself is also always evolving. And as a scrappy startup begins to stabilize, organizational systems form around sustainable growth. And then that becomes like a new homeostasis. Things feel good, so the business wants them to stay that way. And so the thing is, though, it may feel good, but it's even more complicated than that because the business itself is always under its own constant threat. And so this is the innovator's dilemma curve. And so your business, look at that as like the first technology, for instance. It's born, it starts to mature, it hits sort of this market maturity. And then you get to a point where you're listening to feedback, you're trying to figure out how does this take shape. And the thing is, once you've actually figured out a great business and your product is performing really well in market, that's exactly when other people start to look at your business and they realize that your business is a great business to be in. So then they start looking at your stuff and then they start to say, hey, I wonder what we can change. Depending on how well you are able to adapt, whether or not you're able to disrupt yourself and win, determines whether or not you're the second technology or your competitor is. And if it's your competitor, then what happens to your revenue? It starts to go down. It's not great. And so that's why the business is always under constant threat. But it always feels so far away. And for development, that's really hard because they feel the pain of the code base now. They feel the trade-off sooner than later. And this concept, there's so much cognitive dissonance between this concept and that pain that they kind of forget that this is a thing that happens. And it is the single biggest blind spot on engineering teams today. Once they actually start to grasp this, it completely reframes what debt they handle and when, and even what to tackle or what's valuable. There's a couple of businesses that have two examples here that I want to go through. One is an example of a business who did like kind of an interesting, maybe really dramatic shift of this, which was Dropbox. Dropbox kind of stopped drilling the well as deep on the drive itself. I mean, they still work on it, but then they launched Reclaim, which seemed to come out of nowhere, which is a really great calendar app. You start to see a huge shift in their strategy, actually. And this seems to be maybe one of the first steps that they take in disrupting themselves and winning, which is really cool. There's also Nokia, a stark contrast, right? And what's interesting about Nokia is that it feels like they have a total collapse of their old business model. And that's because they had two operating systems at one point for their smartphones. They had Symbian and they had Maemo. Maemo is super interesting because unlike the smartphone operating systems of the past that many of you may not even remember, but Maemo was different. Maemo was based on a Linux kernel. And it was based on a Linux kernel before Android was Android. I knew a guy who's so excited about his Maemo phone, showing me that he could SSH into his server. He was running Emacs. He's one of those old Emacs guys that you just knew how to maglite on him at any given time. I'm calling you out, Chris. I'm sorry. But anyway, I remember that screen being so tiny and being a little bit hard to read. But I mean, live your life, you know? And also on top of that, you know, I guess I can see how if you're a systems guy, you'd really want to be able to have something in your pocket that allows you to do your thing, right? So it was very cool. And you couldn't do that on any other operating system, on any other mobile device before. But instead of looking forward to the future and the possibilities, Nokia made a disastrous move where they made a bet on Symbian. They went all in on the thing that worked instead of the thing that was next. And that backward step destroyed their phone market share moving forward. And it allowed Android, the new second technology, to take hold. As soon as you make a good thing, somebody else is looking at what's wrong with that thing that you made and is looking to make a better one. The sooner that teams can really understand that, the better, really. And it makes a lot of really difficult conversations easy. Whether you're looking at an exit, whether there's like soft revenue, these things can really scare everyone because they're very hard to position depending on what stage your business is in. But every business got there because of this. This is the fifth why. You know, thinking about the 5 why strategy, this is the root issue, right? And so if everybody can align around this, it just makes that conversation so much easier. So anyway, all that's happening on the business side. And all of these things start to create some tension. So just as things are starting to get good on the business side, it's fighting for that stability. It's fighting for homeostasis. It's fighting for growth, and it's fighting to stay relevant. And it's like just at that moment that the debt you incurred to get there, all the trade-offs that you made starts to collect in various ways. And then on top of that, the external technology and design landscape itself is also changing, demanding implementation. And so now you're trying to jam it in wherever you can, but it's not enough. And that unintended neglect really sets in. It starts to impact customer sentiment. Dev work is harder, and then it threatens organizational stability or that homeostasis that we were talking about before. And that's where we start to see some really interesting signs of systems theory dysfunction set in. The first instinct is to tighten controls. We'll just get really disciplined with Scrum. We're just going to turn this ship back around. And sales, we're going to really look at your pipelines and examine them closely. And when that doesn't work, senior leadership starts to get into the state where they're like, hey, I couldn't reach my metrics because your team couldn't reach their goals and vice versa. And so that starts to create this really weird sort of tension. And nobody's really talking about it oftentimes, but like your teams kind of feel it. They start to see, hey, something's happening here. The seniors are fighting. What's going on? And they start to just get a vibe. What can they do to smooth things out and make things easier? And so at a lower level, sometimes you'll get like well-intentioned product or design folks, really empathetic engineering lead, and they will like start to overfunction to try to smooth things out. And it's in that moment that they start creating these really bizarre workarounds. They're kind of almost akin to this weird prison trading scenario. Like, it's just not good. Like, if you implement this thing for me, I'll implement air cover for you to deal with your annoying thing, whatever it is. And I'll trade you ramen for cigarettes. It's like, it's the same thing, right? But at that level, this is being done without intention, with the business in mind. And it feels like a good thing, but it's not a good thing. And even the folks that are in that scenario, they might even be like, hey, I'll show the business what a good thing we did. But it's not a good thing because all this stuff that's happening, it's all happening without looking at what's next. And I have seen years worth of refactoring go out the window because they were refactoring stuff that ended up needing to go because that's where the business was going next. And it actually required some of those products to go away. And I saw tons of refactoring go out the window with that because all of their refactoring efforts were done without any intention whatsoever. That in my mind is even worse because like you have all of this work that's just poof, gone, right? It's almost like your 8-hour workday, instead of being of anything of substance, was actually only email and Slack and nothing else. It feels like you didn't move the needle because you didn't really. And because of all this, it isn't really addressing the root issue. And so when the business doesn't get what they want, the blame starts to shift towards engineering because they don't understand what they need. It's really difficult space to get, They aren't going to really understand your pain. It's tough, even if you explain it well. And engineering blames the business because they have a massive blind spot around the kind of like latent sleeping business risk. And sometimes the business is not great at explaining it. Sometimes they just feel it and they really suck at explaining it. And then they start to get labeled being a sales-driven organization. And that's really where resentment takes root. So it started off as like a few sparks of friction, is now like this raging inferno with cultural issues, burnout, and misalignment. While all that's happening, technology and design is evolving around you, pushing your app further into outdated territory. That's the moment that creates risk for a competitor to come in and eclipse you. It's in that moment specifically. So just to kind of summarize it up, blind spots really galvanize a lack of empathy. Teams end up forming factions, and slow-moving external changes compound it even further. And so we saw a little bit of this with Sonos too. For, I think, about a decade, their legacy stack and their app just worked. So all this debt felt really abstract. So while this tech ossified, the org started to optimize for revenue. So they're looking to couple like a new app for a subscription model tied to the launch of their new headphones. They really want to create this like cloud thing. They had a really great app, but I guess they wanted to like move to a subscription model to kind of make that revenue generating as well and not just being a value add. Very business motivated. Instead of doing an incremental refactor though, to try to get to that stage and maybe timing that a little bit better with maybe some other hardware launch, they opted to rewrite under a really hard launch date tied to a completely new piece of software where the underlying protocols were totally changed. And the moment that new stack went live, it tanked, I think overnight actually, because it just wasn't ready. And internally, as the dates came to pass, there was escalating control leading to blame, burnout. There were even people coming forward publicly to talk about how they weren't listened to in terms of like what needed to be fixed. Post-launch, leadership tightened up very publicly, like The Verge and other news outlets talking about, over-promising these fixes and under-delivering extremely publicly. The release cadences, feature freezes, engineering leaking these frustrations, user revolting. It just came at such a huge cultural cost. That big bang rewrite and hard deadline came to bite them. That post-launch over-promising and under-delivering and tightened control that led nowhere really led to them becoming a premium brand to cautionary tale just like that. The antidote to this is clear, effective communication, but it is the first to go when we're stressed. Actually, our amygdala makes sure of that. As soon as we're stressed out, it starts firing off threats. Our linguistic capabilities go down. There's been some really great studies about that. And so we have to create the right conditions for alignment. If times are good, the time is now. If times are bad, the time is still now to try to do some of these things. And so the first thing might feel counterintuitive, and I want you to hear me out, but it's stop actually thinking about tech debt as debt. and it's to stop talking about it. If you have that huge tech debt set of issues in your backlog, that tech debt project in Jira or Epic, just archive it. If your team's paranoid about losing context, document it in the code and document it in Confluence. But stop creating issues around tech debt. I know it's controversial. No ice boxes either, okay? None of that. All right. Stop talking about it as tech debt. Everything was a decision that was made to get the business to the current state that it's at today. It was a trade-off, and it was a set of effective trade-offs if your business was successful. And the reason I say that is because the business, as we saw in those curves, they always must have their eye forward. Because of that threat of disruption, they must always look forward. And your tech debt, it is a ledger. And a ledger is inherently a backwards view. It's like trying to drive your car forward while only looking in the rearview mirror. It just doesn't work. Thinking about this, how do we look at tech debt? Because it doesn't mean that we just bottle it up and ignore it and never tackle it again. It's also not that, because that will kill your business in the same way. It's about how do we shift everything to that forward-facing view, aligned with the business, and talk about what debt is actually tackled in a timely, tactical way that is inherently higher value because it's attached to the thing that we're about to implement. It's not always about new features. The forward-facing view should be aligned with the business no matter what it is. I mean, I think in this case, we're seeing it a lot with AI, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But this is not like the typical product thing where just everyone wins and engineering just endures and we just ignore it. It's about alignment, timing, and effective value communication of the technical debt that has to work, that has to be done in order to figure out what we do at the right time for the right reasons, not just the thing that annoys us in the moment that we're dealing with it. So I think I found this from Planio, but this is another puzzling thing. Often when I go into these organizations, I find that tech debt and new tooling just straight up has special rules around prioritization, and they seem to follow this other thing. It's like whenever it comes to a feature, everything must be prioritized by its value except for this work. And, honestly, and it's because explaining it in this way, talking about risk, talking about impact, talking about value, it's hard to do, It's hard to describe the work that way. It's hard for product to do that with everything that they're working on, and it's hard for you to do when talking about technical debt. But if you can't have that conversation, if you cannot articulate whether or not the work you're doing is valuable, is it valuable? Is it really valuable, or does it just make you feel bad? And because it feels bad, you think it has value. Like, you have to be able to describe it. And ideally, and I would say non-negotiably, it should follow the same type of prioritization as all the other work, because then it's just very clear. It's very clear. RICE is my favorite way of doing it. There's also the effort value matrix. There's many different ways to prioritize. I'm not going to tell you that you should do yours a specific way over another. But I will say that it just should be consistent so that the work is visible, it's seen, and you can start to see where it fits in. And I think we have to get comfortable with these past trade-offs and debt, because everything we ever work on is debt. Everything. It's all debt. So we just need to get comfortable with it, I think trying to get to this place of like a perfect, easy to work on thing, it's never going to happen. This is a strangler fig. We should get used to this image. We should get used to what do we build around? What do we cut out? What do we prune? Everything that we work on is going to end up this way. And it's okay. That's all right. That's just part of it. That's part of if you're doing it well and you're disrupting an industry. This is kind of what it looks like. And even after laying all this out, if you still have team members that are maliciously complying, quietly dissenting, or in open combat to meet their individual needs over the team's, you should consider if that person was ever a team player to begin with, because they're giving up on you. They're giving up on the team, and they've given up quite some time ago, right? It's a hard thing to do. Give them some grace, give them some time, figure it out. But once they understand this, is there a way to move folks forward? And I think that there is. There's always somebody who has a really hard time with it, but for the most part, you can really get folks to see the future. I know the conversation is also kind of like, well, what about AI? Because AI can do some cool things. It can help alleviate some of the burden of tech debt for sure, especially when you have a good process on how to manage it. But the reason I didn't go purely into AI is because no matter what, with AI, the biggest thing that it needs is context. It needs the right context, the right amount of context at the right time. And if the right conditions aren't in place, it'll just be garbage in, garbage out. And since this is also one of those technological shifts, and it's a conversation I've been seeing over and over again, I won't completely leave it out. I have seen crazy asks. Like a board saying, what's your AI strategy? And it starts out instant enough. And then it's like, how many costs can we cut in people as possible? And your CEO might follow it up with like a memo to say, hey, AI's here. It's an expectation. It's your responsibility. Go out and learn it. Like, what do you do, right? And there's a number of problems. One is that tooling takes a lot of time. Are you giving them the time to do the work? It takes a lot of time because you're actually changing everything about how they use their editor, and they've used their editor the same way for a really long time, okay? You want it the way that you like to work. You're asking them to change everything about it. It can be really difficult, and also implementing AI in and of itself is actually a lot of moving parts. There's fear, uncertainty, and doubt amongst the teams as well, and resistance. What does it mean for my job? What does it mean for me? What does it mean for software development? What does it mean for the company? What does this mean as a big picture? There's a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt around that. Even like what happens in the future if somebody makes a decision about AI at some point, like, hey, anything that's AI generated needs to be out there in open source. Like, what happens then? I've heard that conversation happen online as well. That could be devastating. That could be crazy. Skill gap. Another thing that I've seen with engineering teams as well is that they'll give like one bad prompt and be like, okay, AI is bad now. AI sucks. I don't want to use it. It sucks. And meanwhile, they gave it like this super vague general prompt. The AI had no context. And of course, it gave them nonsense. And then they're like, I can't use it. I'll just use autocomplete. That's it. And that's enough. Meanwhile, they're missing out because there's a lot of really great things you can do. It took me a while to set this up, but I finally figured out how to get like a Figma design one-shotted into like code. And there's a lot of reasons why I wanted to do it that way instead of using sort of these bigger bundled tools like V0, Replit, Lovable, those kinds of things. I am planning on putting some more information out about that later as well. Maybe follow me if you're interested in that, but there is a reason why you want to keep things within the pipeline that you have. And there's a huge skill gap, I find. It's just, even thinking through where are the AI tools that I want to use and how do I use them, it can be really challenging. There's a lot of bad governance around this and a huge amount of security exposure. So, hey, go out and mess around with AI. Okay. And maybe somebody else figured out, similar type of pipeline. I'm going to one-shot a Figma design into code. And you just use an MCP, and that MCP has your API key. And that MCP also can see every design you've ever made. Or what about the GitHub MCP and the vulnerability there? Where if you're working on an open source project in an open source public repository, there can be something injected there that allows you to see private repos. Ooh, what's the posture on that, right? It's tough. I'm also going to say, this might be a bit controversial, there's a lot of undisclosed sponsorships and bad information around AI and what to do with it. And I won't get too deep, but there's one of these really big tools that was just like prompt to app, and they had a disastrous launch. It was absolutely disastrous. Their customers were freaking out on every public forum they could find. And in that exact same time, there were about a half dozen videos I personally saw that came out at that exact same time talking about how great that launch was, with some strange timestamps and things like that. Similar thing happened with Devon as well. Feel free to look that up on YouTube. It's an interesting story, but there's just no way that these tech influencers had a dramatically different night and day experience compared to the rest of their faithful customer base. There's just no chance. It was very weird. And so that's just another layer to think about when it comes to what information am I really getting about these tools? And so it's kind of a thing where, how do we make the time for this as well? This is one of those external technological shifts in the promise of going faster down the road. In any case, this is a really fun conversation. I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to me this far. If you listened all the way to the end, I appreciate it. If you found this helpful, feel free to share it around. If not, thanks for at least checking me out this time around. Take care and have a great day.